Dan and I were debating who wants to start off with the story here at the beginning. I said, I think I have one, and I'm going to title it "The Old Man's Big Speech." 3 children, the oldest, all 3 boys, my 3 sons. The oldest one's going off to college. The next one, he's going to be sitting, he's going to be a senior, and then one going freshman. And I sit him down on the couch and I say, now look, here's your old man's big speech. First thing you got to know, if you get to heaven and I'm not there, here's the reasons why. You might as well hear from me. Now, I also then preface, I can't go back and rewrite the beginning of my story, but I do get to write my own ending. And that's what I'm focused on. And my God or higher power, I believe, is a forgiving God or higher power. And I'm going to end up okay. But I think you just ought to hear from me. And I went in and told them the different stories, but I'll keep it confidential because just to protect the innocent here. The other is, and I said, now look, Spencer, just remember the first thing is you're going off to college, and all of the rest of you, there's no skill in making babies. The skill is learning how not to make babies. As the old saying goes, any fool can, make a baby. It takes a man or a woman to raise one. And I looked at Spencer. I said, also just remember this. You were conceived out of love. And Garrett goes, I knew it. How did you know it, Garrett? And he says, well, no one gets married up in Duluth, Minnesota on January 20th, which is tomorrow, unless they have to. And I said, well, and Spence is just looking at me, and I said I wasn't going to use names, but there's Garrett, and we all chuckled, and that's right.
So your anniversary is inauguration
Tomorrow is
day.
the anniversary on the inauguration day, 37 years. How do you sum it up? Some of it tragic, most of it magic, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Jimmy Buffett, banana head, I might as well throw him in.
I always joke that if I ever got married, I would want to do it on a day like that, a holiday that I could remember really, really easily. And inauguration day, you can't forget that one.
No. And it was cold. It was 30 below. So, then I said, all right. The next thing you need to know, do everything you want to do as a single person or a young man before you decide to settle down. You just lived in our household, and still a couple of you still are. Then you're going to go off to college. Your 20s are to burn it up, and enjoy yourself. Get it out of your system, because here's what's not going to fly. You're going to come to me in your 30s and say, hey, I got to get a divorce. I didn't do these things in my 20s. No, time out. That's not going to fly. So get it out of your system. And then I also then said, no, if you do find the right person, don't let her go in that case. Because, they're hard, it's hard to come by. And if you found her, it's okay. Make that commitment. And then I looked at each of them and I said, all right, here's the next thing. You got to know how to spell the word commitment. It still might not, you still might not make it, in the marriage last, because it's work. But you need to know how to spell the word commitment. How many M's, how many T's in commitments? And they all just looked at me. I said, okay, stay single. And then I think it was close to the last thing. And I said, here's the last and final thing. Now, your mom and I did the best we could with the tools we had in our tool belt every day. We did some good things and we did some poor things. But no, we did the best we can, and I'm sorry for those things that we didn't do well on. But like the internet, there's a filter. There's the good and the bad. What you just need to know is you can keep the good when you all of a sudden, if you're going to be a parent, and you can throw out the bad. But what's not going to happen again is you're not going to come to me and say, I'm screwed up because of what your mother and I did as parents. You're not going to hold us hostage, because you're really holding yourself hostage. And going forward from here on out, it's going to be your choices, your consequences. You got to take personal responsibility for it. And then we talked about, and that leads us into forgiveness. And how do you define forgiveness? And I heard this from someone, and I thought it was brilliant. And forgiveness is giving up on the past, holding, and willing to let go of the past, hoping that it would be different. Because if you can't, you're stuck in the past. And I'll turn it over to you, and that's going to be our topic for today. And I've got some more thoughts on that.
Yeah, it immediately jumps to my mind is my relationship with my dad. And that came about me, really getting past our difficult relationship when I was a kid. Really happened right around the time that we first met. In mid 90s, I was in my early 20s, and that thought process of it's your battle to fight, to let go of those feelings, and for me also it was allowing some level of understanding that the tools that I didn't have, my dad certainly didn't have. And now as I've gotten older and I've started to gain some of the tools that I, at 22 to 25 certainly didn't have, especially around the idea of being able to manage my own temper or manage my own emotions. I don't know that I would have been able to get to that point personally, holding on to those things from the past. So you say it quite a bit that, without forgiveness, that past holds you hostage. So that is a great spot to start out episode 43 of the Valuability Podcast on the topic of forgiveness. The Valuability Podcast is for financial professionals, business owners. And today it's going to be really for anyone interested in making yourself better, making your world better. And we believe that financial success comes from building a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will help you get there. And hopefully we can help you build some of that understanding in your values this week. My name is Danforth Fleek. I was a financial advisor and product wholesaler for over 20 years in the financial services industry, joined each week by my co-host, friend, and mentor, Philip Simonson. Philip was in financial services for over 40 years as a financial advisor, field leader, sales trainer, and senior manager, covering areas such as advisor development and field operations. And that leads right into my next topic point. Philip, you are now officially fully retired. How is life different now?
Well, I'm yes, retired. I guess it's maybe renewal will be the new word. We're doing podcasts, which is great. We have a purpose. I've had time to adjust. I think our listeners have heard, it was a gradual phase out. I'm done with the day-to-day operations. I've gone back to independent contracting instead of being an employee and partial owner of that former company. So it's good. I've got more free time, that's for sure, and I'm enjoying that. So thank you for asking.
Excellent. So I also saw a great pearl of wisdom last night when I was fooling around on Twitter, and I thought I would share it with you.
Sure.
The saying is, and this came from this person's father, I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you. I really liked that.
That's right. And, that leads to a different subject matter. And I'll say shortly, it's just when you're letting someone go. And I think that's the first time you realize you are in a leadership role and you have to let someone go. I learned real quickly, don't ever ask them after it's painful for for yourself and for them. And most of the time, most people already know they they know they need to go or should have moved on. Um, but you're just doing the final act. But don't ask them, uh, or don't stay. Two things. Don't say this. I understand how you feel. Oh, no, you don't. No, you don't. I can empathize, but there's a big difference between empathy and understanding. And then the last thing is, uh, um, I, you know, nah, let's just leave it there because if I keep going, then we're going to go down a rabbit hole on a whole different subject matter, and you all of a sudden all those thoughts are starting to float up from the bottom of the well there. But I wanted to cover the forgiveness piece here.
Yeah, to follow up on that not using that phrase, I understand how you feel. I was also taught to not to use that in situations working with widows or widowers.
Ooh,
Also,
yeah.
a situation where saying that can really backfire on you. And in fact, there I was trained to say, I can't imagine what this must be like for you.
Yeah.
Like to really give that person the space to feel
To
that.
feel that, it's very good, Dan, and because no person can walk in another person's shoes and understand what they've been through. And we kicked off, and we might as well make the segue. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole, but the segue is this, though. And someone you shared about your father. There's a lot of our listeners on here today who grew up in households that certainly weren't perfect, and most households aren't. So let's just deal with that. There's a very few Leave It to Beavers or all the old 50s and early 60s sitcoms. Many of our listeners, grew up with parents who had, deal with the um, challenges, and from addiction to other, things that, are genetic issues that come up that, doesn't make it for necessarily a potential stable household all the time. So you got to learn how, your coping skills. And if you can't, and then you're going to have those, what I'll call oh, the ghosts of the painful past, and they're going to keep haunting you. And that's what, as we said, forgiveness is that we kick this thing off, is that it's the ability to give up, hoping the past is going to would have been different. And the beauty of, and I'm going to talk about two types of forgiveness. First, learn how to forgive yourself, then forgiving others. Now, the forgiving yourself first, and the byproduct of all forgiveness is innovation. Because if you can't forgive, what you're doing is you're staying in the past, and you're playing that replay tape a lot. And that replay tape in the byproduct is resentment. So and that resentment that we're talking about here, it's like a poison pill. You're expecting the other person who you're resentful for, or the things, having them take the pill and it's going to eat them away, and they're eventually going to die. However, what I've found personally is that most of the people don't even know you're resentful. They've moved on with their life. They're not even there, right? And so it's what's happening. It's eating away at you, and you're the one who is eventually is the one dying. So this resentment, you can either choose to take the highway of upsets and anger and resentment, or you can take the road, the dirt road of happiness and forgiveness, which is the road less traveled. Because again, most of us didn't grow up in perfect households. So we bring all this stuff forward into our adult life, and we have to learn how to let it go. Like the story I said with the old man's big story. Eventually, mom and dad, we did the best we could with the tools we had. Keep the good, filter out the bad, but don't hold us hostage and say, hey, you're screwed up because we screwed you up. At some point, this is your life, and you got to go forward.
Like almost everything in the world of values, and there's just a huge amount of subjectivity that goes on, right? Like the level of pain and discomfort and the things that challenge you in relationships, especially parent-child relationships.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be some level of dissatisfaction, right? And playing the magnitude game is the one that I found, and I think this is one of the things that really started me down the road of realizing that in my own relationship, I needed to come to a point of being at peace with the past and trying to build something moving forward. And as you know, and I think I've mentioned it here, my dad did have mental health issues, and I learned that in my teens. And from that point forward, it definitely qualified some of the things, but and it let me at least step away from some of the immediate anger, but there was still a huge amount of resentment there. Also, my dad being in the military, being gone a lot, not having that prototypical throwing the ball in the backyard relationship with my dad. When he was around, he wanted to relax and wasn't up for little kids marching orders of let's go to the zoo or whatever it was that I wanted to do. And as a young person, obviously you don't have that filter of what's going on in an adult's life to run things through. So I did get to a point where I at least understood it, but I really hadn't let go of that resentment. And like I said, it wasn't until my early 20s when I started to look back, and like you said, one of the first things that really helped me with that was putting myself in those shoes and saying, if I had to go through that, as an example, my dad was a career military officer, and obviously he gets to a certain point in his career and mental health issues start coming up. You're not going to get the ability to command a warship, a $2, $3, $500 million warship, if you have mental health problems. And so what my dad had worked for his whole career got snatched away from him by, yes, his dependence on alcohol certainly didn't help his mental situation, but we're here talking about the late 60s, early 70s, where, and especially in the military, these topics of mental health. I think he was one of the first people that didn't get caught up in the system and have some of his actions. I know I shared the story about him crashing the vehicle on base and
Right.
while he was drinking. And there was no tolerance for, it's a mental health problem. Tough. Get to the brig. They weren't having any of that at that point in the world. And so as I got into my career, and secondly, then again, I also saw my mom kind of same thing happen with her, where she got to be a full professor and then became disabled and had her career kind of taken away right at the point where she had worked to get to her whole life. And so being able to take some of those things and put them in reference as I got older really allowed me to think about, well, how would I have reacted to that? And
there's your empathy skills.
Yeah.
And it's awareness, and ultimately it's the self-awareness skills that take place, and that's good. But you like you described it, in your teenage years or even younger, you just don't have those skills. And if you don't have a parent talking about those issues, and I don't like the word mental illness because that's all about shaming, and
Right.
and that's not what we need. That's not helping anyone. We've gotten better, but if you, like you described, uh, if you can't let go of that resentment, as we said, then you're stuck in the past. You can't innovate because you keep replaying the tape back in your head over and over again. And therefore, that resentment, if you're not careful, it turns into anger. And that anger is going to lead to a closed heart. And it's not going to be able to receive or give love or, kindness. Right? Because concern and resentment can't exist together. One pushes out the other. And I think about concern again, is that's your empathy. Those are the key skills that, one needs to have, is that self-awareness skills to be able to, create significance and lead a successful life, and defined by that person. I'm not going to define it, but I think it's important that our listeners, and if anything they can take away here with that forgiveness, is make sure well, let's talk, how do you do it? Before we jump off and talk about then forgiving others, is first learn how to forgive yourself. But what are some of the steps to forgiving yourself and letting go of the past? One, you got to identify it. When you got that resentment there, what's causing it? So first, identify it. And because we all have that self-talk, those, negative thoughts in our heads, those actual thoughts, don't ignore them. They're there. It's that little voice being played 6 inches between the ears. Write them down. And, what's causing it? Is it really real? Most of the time, you're going to find out they're not even real anymore. That's that fear, false evidence appearing real. But this might sound, for those of you, I'm just going to ask you to, and this is one of the things that, trust me, practice it. Take for 2 weeks. I would encourage you to pray for 2 weeks for the person or things that you resent, but you should pray it receives everything that you want for yourself. Pray for the things you want for yourself or for those others, because then if you can do that, and what will naturally occur, again, the concern and resentment can't coexist. If you're praying for 2 weeks straight for things that you're resentful of, or the person or persons, and you're praying for that they receive these items of kindness, or that you're going to list out positive, it'll push it out. It'll take time.
The biggest step for me, I would say that really the final step for me was, and we've talked about this, I think at least around this topic a couple of times, is the connection between your emotional state and your memories. And when I first had a psychologist explain that to me, that the portion of your brain that regulates your emotions also is tied to memory. Because there's always this separation between self-accountability and this idea that I've done something wrong, right? Like that I always looked at my own temper as a fault in my character that I needed to suppress and just beat down by sheer force of will. And that there, you get this idea that there's something wrong with you because you have this, essentially what's described as a character flaw. And when I was that door was opened and it was shown to me that, hey, the part of your brain that runs your emotions also is tied to memories. And not that it absolves you of the way that you act. Mm-hmm. I'm always very self-critical when thinking about that side of things of, oh, well, such and such happened to me when I was a kid. Like you said, you can't hold other people hostage, or even at that point, you're really holding yourself hostage.
Thank you.
Right.
Yes.
But it allowed me the permission then to say, hey, there's a reason why. Like, I always explained that to people, that my anger, I have a very strong will. I can beat down my temper, but there were times where literally when people use the expression, you see red. Like, I don't remember what I saw, what was going on. Like, I literally had essentially an out of body experience when I would get that angry. Now, my temper was never focused at people. Like, I was always very aware of not physically hurting people, but I did get physically violent, break things, throw things, smash things, and then you get done and you look at it and you're like, well, that didn't help anything.
No.
That didn't help anything at all. And but like I said, it gives you the ability to look at yourself and say, okay, there's some work to do here, but I'm not. And again, it's such a fine line. It's not my fault that I'm feeling this way. That the actions are what's wrong. So we need to find a way to, attack the issue at hand and focus on that, on how do you alter that process of becoming angry and
Right.
finding that source. And I don't want to get too much off into the actual therapy process that I used, but because that's a topic for a whole separate episode.
Mhm.
But, again, giving yourself that ability to say, you're not evil, you're not wrong, you're not broken, you're not incorrect. Like, there's this weight that you carry there. But like I said, it's a fine line, because you can't just say, well, it's my memory. It's my memories that do this, and it triggers my emotions, and I have no control, so I'm not responsible for it. No, in the end, you're still ultimately responsible.
Well, that's right, and that's what you rightfully described there. Look, the emotions are neither good nor bad. They come from external stimuli. They they hit the limbic section of the brain, and that's where the emotions reside. And boom, you're either going sad, glad, or mad. But there's many more emotions, but there's the big three. And 2/3 of the people, when it goes sad, glad, or mad, the emotions come in. They just act. 2/3 go from identifying the emotion, and then they just act. Versus, you think of an experiential triangle. In the top of the triangle, the apex, that's where thoughts are. Over in the bottom left-hand corner, that's where emotions are. And over on the far right-hand corner of that continuum is behaviors or actions. Very few will go from the emotions up to the thoughts. And those thoughts reside in that prefrontal cortex of the brain. And that's where logic and reasoning and decision-making occur. And the best way you can do it, we used to play what's called the freeze game. And I learned this from, a gentleman, a psychiatrist who, he's hired out by major NFL and American League baseball teams, and to help the players make good decisions. Or like the relief pitcher, he'd work with the relief pitcher coming in. It's the bottom of the ninth. Bases are loaded. There's one out. You're taking over a 3-2, a count that isn't in your favor. How do you handle it? And you've got to, and they play the freeze game. And because the great news is, you can teach your mind you can reprogram it because of the mental, you can create new neuroplasticity. You can create, in essence, a new mental maps. So you don't have to keep going down
Absolutely.
those old mental maps. And you can say, hey, all right, playing the freeze game, stop. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I thinking and what am I doing? So and you just write it down and try to do those free, I'd encourage our listeners, do the freeze game over the course of a day. Do it, 5, 6 times or, even more, but do it for like 28, 30 days. But
Yeah, once
then I'll just finish. And then what I do think you got to do is, like you said, with your anger, for people who are listening, say, well, they want to, without us going down a whole new session, and we can do a whole new session on this, but what you've got to do, that the amygdala hijack takes over, the flight or fight syndrome, and that's from Neanderthal days, for survival. We shut off the oxygen to that prefrontal cortex because of the drugs that get released in our body, cortisol, which is a brain inhibitor, blocking you from accessing the prefrontal cortex because you need the oxygen in your blood to fight. And so my point here, and then I'll turn it over to you, is just take some deep breaths. And before, first, when you get that amygdala hijack, first thought wrong is kind of that guiding principle. And stop, breathe, 2 or 3 deep breaths. What am I feeling? What's it causing me to think? And then hold off on doing your behaviors. And you got a better chance of not responding in a more appropriate fashion, shall I say.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you, like I said, when that door was thrown open to me and I was made aware of that connection, it doesn't allow you to go back and say, oh, this is the memory that, makes me feel anger or makes me act out violently when I get angry. But it allows you then to understand that when you start going down that road, and I always say me losing my temper was always the end of some cavalcade of stupidity. That's the phrase that I use to describe it, right?
Stupid is optional, listeners.
But it's small bits of stupidity that add up over a time frame, right? I've been working all day. I didn't get enough sleep the night before. I haven't eaten. I'm in a rush because I'm late to do something, and I'm trying to squeeze too much in. And so now all of a sudden you've stacked all of these emotional, stresses on yourself. And then because I'm running late, I grab too many grocery bags out of the car. And as I'm getting toward the door, the dog gets in my way, and I don't want to take the time to set the bags down and deal with the dog. So I swing my foot at him to try and get him out of the way. And he doesn't understand what that means, of course, because he's a dog and he has not been in that situation before. And he leaps towards me, and I drop one of the bags. And then all of a sudden I pitch all the rest of the bags into the backyard because I snap at that point, right? And then all of a sudden you're standing in the backyard with all your groceries thrown all over the backyard and thinking, how did this happen? Right, what triggered that? And it as you start to then notice these things, I start to notice them earlier and earlier in the process.
Right. There's your reprogramming that brain.
Right. Now there are times where I catch it, like literally on the way to the grocery store. I'll start feeling, in that example, like, oh man, I'm stressed. Like I'm in a state where this could be happening. And so I go back to my positive thought, the therapy that I was exposed to. When you catch yourself, you go to a certain routine of a memory. And for me, that memory was sitting in my room singing to records when I was a little kid.
Oh, so you went to your serenity place, a peaceful spot, and a good replacing that voice. Yeah.
Well, and interestingly, also, it's from another really positive memory, which was when my mom would send me to my room because I was acting out. She said she always knew when I was ready to come out because I would be sitting in front of my record player listening to
Yeah.
records and singing. And so both of those things together make that a really positive memory for me. Right.
That's very good.
And now I've also added music. I have a certain piece of music that I love that is part of that process. And as you get better and better and better at it, like I said, you catch it earlier and earlier. But here's also the other interesting thing about it is the elasticity works in the other way. If I stop practicing, I regress. And if I get lazy about it and don't take those little moments of frustration and use it there, and that's where, yes, you hear that all the time, right? Pause and take breaths. Absolutely. But whatever your trigger is, and of course, mine's anger. It could be anything. Whatever your specific situation is, whether it's anger or perhaps it's more of a depression, whatever that triggers in you, you need to practice it with the other smaller items as well, because that then leads up to the bigger ones, and to not let it go. You can't stop and say, oh, I there was at one point where I thought, oh, really? Because I had one of those situations. It was a whole another cavalcade of dumb things, and I was rushing and I dropped something out of a cabinet and I stood up and banged my head on the cabinet. And normally, if I did something like that, I'd slam the cabinet shut and storm around holding my head and swearing. And I just started laughing and sat down on my couch. And it was that moment where I was like, who is this guy? Like, I would never react that way in the past. And then I took that as kind of my victory lap. And so I stopped doing some of the stuff that I had been doing. And then it's when I saw that regression coming back.
Powerful stories as we talk about forgiveness here. And I thank you for sharing. And I think those are real life examples, no doubt. And a couple other little tidbits I would add, and I said I would at the beginning I was going to talk about, because we're coming up on time here, forgiving others, but I would share this. Other helpful tips is, as you get out of bed in the morning, just positive affirmations, or just affirmations, positive thinking. I can go either way on that. There's some nuances to that trip my trigger and said, well, I'm not full believer in all that, but what I will, this affirmation, I'm going to have a great day, or I'm going to make it a great day. That helps me set the tone for the day. Also, at the end of the night, ask yourself quiet before you go to bed, what went well today? And what are the 10 things I'm grateful for? You do your grateful list, but you get to feed that brain. And because what you believe and expect, that's what you become. It's not what you wish for and want. It's what you believe and what you expect. And as you said in this, Dan, we're not minimizing anything. You still own your behaviors. You have to own it. Just like I said, at the very beginning of this whole story, look, you can't hold your mom and dad here hostage for the way you are when you're now an adult. I owe them sincere apologies, and that's the other thing. And when's it safe to forgive others? And I learned this from a Native American Indian woman her husband was the tribal leader We were flying out to LA. She was on the Rockefeller Foundation. I'm probably saying too much now. And she saw me reading this book and she knew, okay, I've been through some stuff, just by the book. And we started talking and she said, all right, here's what I learned. You know, when's it safe to forgive someone else? Because, and she said, these four things you must see these four things and observe these four things. Otherwise, you're going to get burned again by this person. So one is, they apologize. They say they're sorry. Two, they're sincere about it. Three, they try to right the wrong. Well, they don't try; they right the wrong. The best they can with the tools they have, and it's they're sincere in doing that. And four, they promise they're never going to do it again. Now, I put an asterisk to the last one. If some of you, we have many listeners here who have grown up, and we've joked. Behind every joke, there's a little truth. You've shake my family tree, a bunch of CIAs fall out, Catholic, Irish alcoholics. So any of you who've grown up in a household of alcoholics, or you're a child of a parent who is an alcoholic, get ready. There's always going to be a bomb that's ready to go off. You just don't know when. So you're on eggshells the whole time. And then they go into recovery, and some people get what they call the pink cloud. Boom, they get it right away. Others, it's start and stop. So when is it safe to start trusting them again? And what's the difference between a slip or a slip is it's can be they slipped, they fell back into old behaviors, but then they come back to you and tell you right away, hey, I slipped. There's no lies about it, there's no BS about it, and here's what I'm doing differently. And they're going back to working their program or whatever they're doing to make sure that they I've got the wheels on the track and going in the right direction again. If you don't see that, then they're probably back in full mode again, and you have to take care of yourself. And you got to, and don't give them the personal power. And you're giving your personal power away when you're letting their behavior starting to control how you're feeling and what you're doing. You got to put up your boundary work.
Well, even in a situation where somebody isn't capable of that,
a younger child, someone who does,
younger child, or in my experience, from my standpoint, I just knew that was a bridge that my dad was never going to get across. He's not a really reflective person in that, and he didn't have the tools, wasn't given the tools, was at a point where even if he had been given the tools, he probably wouldn't have been successful. And I just had to put a bow on it. But the caveat there is you need to then get yourself in a situation where they can't hurt you anymore.
That's your boundaries. Yep.
We had got our relationship to a point where it was friendly, and what was in the past was in the past, and I could forgive him and understand who he was, where he was in the world. And now it's interesting that as he has become gone down the road of dementia, people say that when you get into that phase with that mental state, that the true person comes out. My dad is like this big, sweet, soft boy, little kid. I went to look after him so my stepmom could have a break, and we got in an argument, and he wasn't listening to me, and of course he didn't understand why, and I kind of snapped at him, and he came out the next day. He's like, "Are you still mad at me?" And I'm like, no, Dad, I'm not. He's like, because you yelled at me last night, and I just want to make sure that you're not mad at me. And my dad never asked me that ever in my life.
Well, that's good. That's
and
powerful.
So I always knew that, though. Like, I always knew that underneath the struggles that he had, that he was this person, and that there's a part of my personality that some of that empathy and care that does come from him. And so, being able to get to a point where I can say, look, I know he's not going to change, but I also understand the things that made him that way. And so that's a good spot for us to wrap up the main section and move on to our article review. I know we wandered around a bit on that, but as always, a fascinating conversation. Our article review for this week is why flexibility may be the least helpful thing companies can offer working parents right now. I'll go ahead and throw a link up to this on Twitter and on our Facebook page, and then also on our website, value-ability.com, under the Contact Us tab. I'll put a link to the article. The main thesis of the article, just briefly, is essentially that during the pandemic, a lot of employers have, for white-collar workers, have thrown benefits at them to kind of offset some of the stresses of what has been going on, the fact that they have their kids at home, so on and so forth. And the author is reminding corporations that, hey, there are also other ways that you can make an employee's life better. Specifically, they talk about focusing on public policy and throwing their the weight of their corporate name behind different policy initiatives at the governmental level. I don't disagree with that. I think corporations should act on behalf of all of their stakeholders, their shareholders, their employees. I always try to explain to people talking about companies to think of it as a small business, right? Like if you're trying to figure out how stock dividends work, I always think, okay, let's break it down to a one person sole proprietorship, and it kind of makes things easier for people to understand, because the dynamics are similar. Some things change when you get to a corporation, but the dynamics are similar. But my main thought on this is that there's a huge chunk in between just throwing benefits at people. And some of the benefits they mention are like extra vacation time, tutoring services for kids, etc. And then public policy. Well, there's a huge gap in the middle of that, which is tuning up private company policy, tuning up their own policies and adapting actually the way that they interact with their employees. Not just, hey, there's benefits on one side and public policy on the other. I think the huge gap that this article doesn't talk about is actually adapting your business to fit the stresses that are going forward. And I'm not saying that I have any answers in terms of what those adaptations look like, but I think we've really missed an opportunity. And to some extent, we kind of stumbled, right? Because think back, we're now 1 year. We were just starting to hear about the coronavirus at this time last year, right? And it was just starting to peak up in China. And so to some extent, I think corporations looked at it and thought, well, we're looking at a 4 to 6 month time frame, and a lot of us misjudged that we would still be here a year later. But I think now is the time where we start to think about how do we actually adapt our businesses in the long term to fit some of these stresses. And then if things do go back to essentially, what we say is quote unquote normal before COVID hit, then you keep what was good and you let the rest go away. But I just thought there was a big gap here in terms of saying, well, there's the one side of, just tossing benefits at people. And then the other side is trying to influence government policy. Like there's something in the middle.
Right. I'd agree, Dan. Yeah, I would just, the whack-a-mole approach isn't, it's starting to show the signs of stress, and
that's a great way to put it, right? It's not a business planning approach. It's kind of a whack-a-mole at the results that are coming out of the back end.
Right. We're not looking at what's the old cause effect. So you're going to have to step back and figure it out. And I've got faith. Generally, we do. We've been more reactive. We'll start being more proactive. History would have told us these epidemics come every 100 years. They just aren't a 4 to 6 months. There's the first wave. There's the second wave.
Yeah, I also don't want to get caught up in the, well, you should have known game. That
could have stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm not implying that at all. But at this point now, we're a year in. It's about time that businesses start stepping back and saying, okay, how are we actually going to adapt going forward? The example that I'll throw out is that a local restaurant down the street from me has become basically a 6-restaurant kind of virtual food court. And so they've gone away from they were kind of a burger and, gourmet burger place. And they've added a bunch of other styles of kitchens and created essentially a virtual food court. And when I saw that, I was like, there you go. Like, hey, it totally sucks. I can't imagine being in the restaurant business right now, but it is what it is. And rather than standing around and hoping that it changes, what can you do to try and adapt to that? So,
I think personally we're seeing a lot of that, and the stronger ones who do it, are that definition of insanity. We know that doing the same things over and over again, expecting to get different results, not going to work. It is what it is. Bill Murray, you know what he said about that, Dan? Nothing's going to change, and you're blank. We'll just say you're screwed. So it doesn't have to be. It is what it is. You gotta get out. You can't think about the whack-a-mole. That isn't gonna work. That reaction isn't gonna do it. You're gonna have to think about, create some new paradigms or new models of how you're gonna do business, like you just described.
Yeah, and to our listeners out there, what are some of the innovative business changes you have seen from different businesses around you during the pandemic? Shoot us an email or hit us up on Twitter and let us know. We'll share those in upcoming episodes. If you do have topics that you would like us to cover or questions for us, you can email us at info@value-ability.com, or as I mentioned, hit us up on our social media links. All of our social media links, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, are at value-ability.com under the Contact Us tab. Wherever you find us, please do a like, review, subscribe, and share. We are out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn. We have a YouTube channel. Search Value-Ability on YouTube to find us there. And also on our episode player, value-ability.com, under the episodes tab. Next episode 44, creating wow moments. This is Philip's topic, so I'm going to be very excited to find out more about that next week.
I love that word. I can spell it backwards and forwards and still get it correct. That's perfect for this Norwegian.
And you know what wow upside down is?
Yes.
Mom.
Heaven, as any child, heaven and earth should be at their mother's feet. Mom.
Wow upside down is mom.
I figured that one out, Dan. I like that.
So what is the most challenging situation you have ever faced in which you had to forgive someone? Reach out to us. Just mentioned all of our contact info. Reach out to us. Let us know what that situation was, and we will share some of those in upcoming episodes. As always, thank you for listening. Be sure to join us next week. And remember that financial success comes from building a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will help you get there. This is a podcast collaboration, not a peer-reviewed journal or a sponsored publication. We make no representations as to accuracy, completeness, correctness, suitability, or validity of any information in this podcast, and will not be liable for any errors, omissions, or delays in this information, or any losses, injuries, or damages arising from its display or use. All information is provided on an as-is basis. It is the listener's responsibility to verify their own facts. You should be aware of the real risk of loss in following any strategy or investment discussed on this podcast. Strategies or investments discussed may fluctuate in price or value. Investors may get back less than invested. Investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast may not be suitable for you. This material does not take into account your particular investment objectives, financial situation, or needs, and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for you. You must make an independent decision regarding investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast. Before acting on information on this podcast, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances, and strongly consider seeking advice from your own financial or investment advisor. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. Assumptions are not reflective of the position of any entity other than the authors, and since we are critically thinking human beings, these views are always subject to change, revision, and rethinking at any time. Please do not hold us to them in perpetuity.